So the next speaker is Alessandro Tavano from the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt. And he'll tell us about internal rhythms to sentences. If we can please have your attention. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's really a privilege. It's a privilege because I just got into the field, so I am actually humbly trying to show you what I have been doing up to now. And my main goal for today is to put a tiny leaf on top of a nice syntactic tree and see at which frequency it vibrates. So we've been using, and I will show you data, the frequency tagging approach for many reasons. So the frequency tagging approach is such, the main assumption is you stimulate the brain with some stimuli at a given frequency, and the idea is that the neuronal assemblies that are coding actually for that stimulus would oscillate at that frequency too. And one of the main reasons why we do this is because this way we can get a higher signal-noise ratio with respect, for example, to averaging. And so we can see in this case that in the original signal there are two main components actually dominating. The other reason, as I said, is that we can actually see something going on very specifically, which is stimulus specific. For example, if you have a face that appears with a specific rhythm, then you can also as well do the simple FFT transformation, and you will see a response that runs at the frequency that you deliver the stimulus at, and this response is effectively stimulus specific because, for example, it can distinguish between standard and deviant as we show in this case. So one thing that we could do at this point is to tag speech, and we can, for example, start by putting together words and seeing what's happening, and then we can see also what's happening at a higher level. We could do it visually, but actually we are more interested in the spoken counterpart of language, and we're more interested in this because language, or speech and language actually, appear or are delivered at different time scales, and if we look at larger constituents, which is what I will try to show you today, the frequencies at which we would likely concentrate on would be here what originally was defined stimulus-induced theta oscillations between 1 and 8 hertz. So this later on was reevaluated, and in that model you can distinguish the theta doing the segmentation component between 3 and 9, and then you have the delta at 3 or below 3, and we know that for these low frequencies they actually can entrain or to the slow fluctuations of the energy in the stimuli, in the speech stimuli, but as Nai and Ilana showed, we are more interested in understanding whether we can go beyond the purely acoustics. So Nai did this great study where I'll start now to use a few linguistic terms so that gradually you use repetition suppression to be less to be used to it. So we have sentences composed of one noun phrase and one verb phrase, and this structure repeats in time many times, up to 10 times for one trial. And when you do the FFT, you see obviously the stimulation frequency. It says the frequency of the syllable because each word is actually monosyllabic. But you also see the frequency of the sentence, and you see what is interpreted as the frequency of the phrase. And the conclusion is that the brain entrains to the stimulation, or syllabic stimulation in this case, or word simulation, which is regular at 250 milliseconds. But with this trick, regularizing or isochronizing speech, we can also see that the brain entrains to information that is actually not in the stimuli at all. So Nai used stimuli with in Chinese and also in English. In English, you can see the same thing. So if what you deliver is individual words that are not connected, then you obtain only the syllabic or word level response. But if the words connect in phrases and sentences, then you obtain the sentence rate and the phrase rate. This is all nice. You can see maybe there is something going on here, but the idea is that we get a scale that relates to the internal structure, not only to the higher node, but also to the internal structure of the stimuli that we deliver. And our point was actually whether these low-frequency brain rhythms are also sensitive to changes in phrase structure. So if we make the stimuli a bit more complex, what's happening? And so this is the first thing that we do, or just an example of what we do. So we have a replication of the stimuli from Nai. There is a sentence, and then a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase then refers to a determiner, a noun, and the verb phrase to a verb and an adjective. So for example, mein Schrank ist alt, which is my cabinet, I think, is old. You can have a sentence that is still 4 words. So from a word perspective, it's the same sentence. But actually, the structure is very different. There's still a higher node, which is a sentence, but the noun phrase in this case has just the noun. So it's one element constitutes the noun phrase, and the verb phrase is internally complex. There is a verb, and then there is a second embedded noun phrase. So at word level, or since we're using monosyllabic words at the syllabic level, they are the same, but the internal structure is different. So again, this is the first pair or couple of conditions that we will use. I will show you the structure for 8 conditions because we wanted to test different behaviors. So each word is running at 4 Hertz, and then this is the internal structure, condition A and B. And then we have condition C and D. So condition C is a different replication of condition B. So the noun phrase is still 1 word, and the verb phrase, instead of having a second noun phrase, as an adjectival phrase. The condition D is the mirror, at least from a structural viewpoint at the level of phrases, of condition D. We have conditions E and F. In this case, we applied a crucial manipulation. So up to now, we have been exposed to results where a word is running at 250 milliseconds, and the sentence itself is running at 1 Hertz. In this case, though, we have 5 words that constitute the first sentence. The noun phrase has 3 words and the verb phrase 2. And in the AF condition, it's just the mirror condition. So the noun phrase is 2 words and the verb phrase is 3 words. And the crucial manipulation is the following, that we have 5 words to complete a sentence. So this means that the integration rhythm cannot be 1 Hertz, but it must be 0.8 Hertz. And then to see a little bit more what's going on below 1 Hertz, we had also condition G versus H, and in this case it's the same as E versus F, but instead of having monosyllabic words, we have disyllabic words. So each word is composed of 2 syllables. And so it's the same structure, 3 elements constitute the noun phrase and 2 the verb phrase for G, and the mirror image for H. Here, although, since the individual words are disyllabic, we need to run slower. So the stimulation, the difference is that the stimulation is at 2 Hertz. It's important to have a look, although brief, at how we constructed the materials. So as Nai suggested, we created the individual words with a text-to-speech synthesizer to prevent prosodic co-articulations or co-articulation effects prosodic. But we also flatten the pitch of each individual word, so pitch cannot be an indication of prosodic structure. You'll see this creates a slightly robotic voice, but it's still well understandable by German native speakers. And another thing that we did, we wanted to be 100% sure that a low-level information could not determine what we find, and that we would tag as high-level. And for this reason, what we run using Selix an analysis for each condition of the biphone transitional probabilities between and within boundaries, phrase boundaries. Between means the transitional probability, for example, between mein and schrank, and between ist and alt. This is within a phrase. And between is the probability between schrank and ist. So what we wanted to be sure is that there was no effect of boundary, and there was especially no interaction of boundary with condition. And we find, of course, differences between conditions because the conditions are structurally either longer or shorter, but we find no significant effect of boundary. So from a low level biphone to biphone transitional probability, we are fine. This is a trial structure that we used. It's very simple, and it replicates exactly what Nai used. So we had a series of sentences linked one after the other with no gap, so without solution of continuity. And the regular trials in this case are quite consistent number, it's 42. And each trial was composed of 10 sentences. And then we had participants detect in a few trials, like 16% of the remaining ones, in which case there was, in which trials the sentences were actually ungrammatical. So for example, here you have a verb followed by the determiner, an adjective, and a noun. That cannot build up a sentence in any way. So, and position number 4 as well. So participants would press a button to this odd trial after the trial is finished. So I would like to play a little video for you, and the video will illustrate the sound stimulation that we have, the acoustic stimulation, for at the beginning for conditions A versus B, and then for conditions E versus F. So you don't need to remember the names, so I will show you. This way you can have a look at what will later turn out to be the crucial conditions. I hope the sound works.
Mein Pferd ist braun, ihr Kind war krank, dein Tee wird kalt, ihr Kleid ist eng, mein Rock war kurz.
Pretty fast.
Sie wirft den Stein, ich mag kein Brot, er will mein Geld, sie hat ein Pferd, er schleicht sein Boot.
And now E.
Milch im Glas bleibt frisch, Wurst mit Kraut macht stark, Wein aus Mainz riecht gut, Fritz aus Trier wird kahl, Glück im Spiel ist toll. Mein Ei ist fast gar, mein Chef war sehr streng, kein Schnaps ist so stark, ihr Buch ist recht gut, viel Geld macht sehr reich.
So as you see, it's pretty well controlled. Okay, so what are our predictions or our expectations? So basically, if there is no entrainment to sentences, we expect simply an effect at the frequency that we stimulate at, in this case, at the stimulation of 4. But if we, oops, all right. But if we have, a construction that can, or the internal creation of a rhythm that has to do with the sentence, then we should find something, some activity ringing at 1 Hertz. These are the basic outcomes that we would expect. And here is what we find. So first of all, it's native speakers of German. So it's although for non-native speakers, the stimuli that I played may have sound very complicated. Actually, the behavior was really consistently high. This is also helped by the fact that that is an oddball structure. So measures like d prime are inflated. But as I'll show you later, we also have confirmation from 50-50 distribution. So the important thing here is, so for the structures A and B running at 4 Hertz, we find actually no difference. We find, first of all, the stimulation frequency and then the sentence frequency, which are both significant. But we find that also a 2 Hertz frequency is represented and a 3 Hertz rhythm is also represented. This is a result that it's a bit new with respect to the data of NAI. And for the conditions C and D, which were a bit more difficult, as you see from the D primes, still we find a very good stimulation frequency, the ringing at sentence frequency, and the harmonics. The 3 is the same in both and is significant in condition D for 2. There is a variability in subject by subject in which conditions we can find these bumps. So from this perspective, what seems to be the case is that we have a ringing of the stimulation frequency at 1 Hertz that then goes at 2 Hertz and 3 Hertz. So in my view, this suggests that the stimulation frequency could actually be creating harmonics, an harmonic structure. However, these conditions are not so telling because in these conditions, the 1 Hertz could still come from like a subharmonic of the 4 as well, and the 2 as well could be a subharmonic of the 4. So the only discriminant difference, the only discriminant information is the 3 Hertz, which cannot be a subharmonic of 4, but can be an harmonic of 1. So now I'm going to show you why the next conditions where we have 5 words are actually interesting. And they are interesting because here too you have a significant harmonic structure. The stimulation frequency is at 4 Hertz and the sentence frequency is at 0.8 Hertz, but then crucially the harmonic is at 1.6 and 2.4 and even a little bit 3.2. And these harmonics cannot come from the stimulation frequency, by definition. So they must be harmonics of the sentence rhythm, the internal sentence rhythm. And the same goes for the disyllabic. For the disyllabic conditions, so as you see here, the original stimuli were running at 2 Hertz, and so they create a nice sentence rhythm at 0.4 Hertz, so similar to what Alana also found at 0.5. So we have broken the 1 Hertz barrier in a way, and the ringing is concurrently then at consequently at 0.8 and 1.2, and perhaps some int at 1.6, but not really. So what seems to be the case, at least from our stimuli, is that the sentence rhythm produces its own harmonics. And these harmonics are, so if the sentence rhythm is at 1 Hertz, then the harmonics are at 2 Hertz and 3 Hertz. Here for the A's and the B's, the C's and the D's with some uncertainty. If the sentence rhythm is at 0.8 Hertz or 0.4 Hertz, then the harmonics are consequently at 1.6, 2.4, or 0.8, 1.2. So from our data, what seems to come up is a harmonic structure. The harmonic structure is informative because it suggests that the sentence frequency is not directly derived as a subharmonic from the stimulation frequency in any case. And if you look at the scalp distributions, one can also see that the sentence the scalp distribution of the sentence response is very similar to the one of the first harmonic, in this case represented, but different with respect to the potential generators, with respect to as compared to the stimulation frequency. And the same goes on whether you have 4 words as before or 5 words. Conditions E and F. And if you look at the sound intensity of the stimuli that we give, then you have a huge peak in the stimulation frequency at the word rate, but nothing else. Then we replicated this data with a slightly different proportion of regular and oddball trials, and we still have very good and consistent responses. The sentence frequency, the stimulation frequency, but again, the harmonics, the sentence frequency at 0.8, the stimulation frequency at 4, and again, the harmonics. It's a bit more difficult because the signal-noise ratio here is less good, as we were coding only half of the available trials, since we were coding the trials at which participants were pressing the button saying that they were regular, so they were grammatically correct. But it's confirmed in the slow stimulation paradigm, 0.4, a very strong 0.8 in both conditions, and the classic stimulation frequency. So, again, as I said, the harmonic structure is what comes out. Although, as I said, the signal-noise ratio is much lower, but the structure is remarkably similar. And so from this, we conclude that there is definitely cortical entrainment to an internal rhythm that is not in the stimuli. And this is a sentence rhythm at slow frequencies below, even at slow frequencies below 1 hertz. And the creation or the finding that these sentences create their own harmonic structure is very important, because it, when appropriately manipulated, the stimuli show that the harmonic structure supports independence of the sentence rhythm, the internal sentence rhythm, from the stimulation frequency. So there can be two hypotheses that, with respect to why we have an harmonic structure. One very basic hypothesis is that the encoding of the sinusoid, or the internal rhythm of the sentence, is imprecise, and that would create the harmonics. Or actually that the oscillator that is coding for this internal rhythm is nonlinear, and a nonlinear oscillator creates harmonics by definition. Second sum up, the order is a bit weird. So we find no evidence for the build-up of internal structure. This could be, I think, one possibility is, first of all, the paradigm is delivered, so the stimuli are delivered in a way that, in a blockwise manner, and so participants receive over and over the same stimulus, the same structure. And obviously, the most, from a purely perceptual viewpoint, the most reliable structure is the highest one, the one running at slower frequencies. So participants can extract everything once they have the higher structure, or they keep going on with the higher structure. And so this would be Odette's anticipation-driven delta from a functional viewpoint. And the other possible conclusion is that there is a limit in the type of approach that we take. So when we FFT these long sequences, what we get is we see only what repeats periodically. So with this, I would like to thank you for listening to my legal idea of oscillations or of entrainment, and I would like to thank my collaborators. Thank you.
Okay, we have more than 20 minutes for questions.
Have you done an FFT on the stimuli themselves to
Yes.
Prove that these harmonics aren't present there?
Yes, so it's a bit complicated because, so what I did, I looked into the different constituents. So sometimes you have 3 words, sometimes 2 words. And then what is nice is that I see a slightly faster rhythm when it's 2 words than when it's 3 words, so that's a nice sanity check. But it's a bit difficult for me to see what it is because of the simulation or the number of words that I use. I don't know whether it's simply the harmonic that repeats within the individual phrases or simply the integration across the phrases. It's a bit complicated. So for example, if you have 3 words, let's say the precision of the, if you have 3 words running at 4 hertz, you would get 750 milliseconds, right? And so out of 1,250 milliseconds, and I get something that could be 1.30, 1.6, something in there, in between there. So the precision that I have is not sufficient. We have some pilot data with longer sentences, with longer constituents, and there I think I can see that, what it is.
Thanks, Alice. It's a really interesting way to disentangle the harmonic structure versus online phrasal building. I was thinking, though, that as you mentioned, that the FFT will only give you the periodic patterns, right? And so your phrases in the 5-word sentence case are 3 and 2, so it might be harder to find in the FFT. So just one thought about how to get around that might be to, we started at 4, went to 5, now let's go to 6, right? And then you can have phrases that are either 3 words long or 2 words long.
Yeah.
And then if it's harmonic structure, it shouldn't matter. It should find the same effect. And if it's about phrasal buildup, you'll see that peak at either 2 or 3.
Yes.
Have you done thought about?
Yes, this is the direction that we're going to see whether what it is about this harmonic that replicates. Yeah.
Sorry, Greta and then Nancy? So Nancy, sorry, there's someone in front of you. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
First of all, thanks for the interesting presentation. I was interested in the ungrammatical trials that you included.
Okay.
Did you analyze those?
Yes, I could analyze them when it's, I don't have it here, but I have analyzed them, especially in the second condition, in the second replication experiment, because we have 25 trials that are actually coded as, or actually regular, and 25 that are odd or ungrammatical. And what I see the structure still there, but it's the peaks are smaller.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I don't know whether it's because attention is taken away from the stimulation, from the training, to the because the onset of an ungrammatical sentence is an event.
Yeah.
It's an attention capturing event. So it may be that it takes simply away from the attentional deployment of resources on the rhythm, actually.
Because they were basically word lists, right? There was nothing to build structure from.
No, the ungrammatical are actually most of the sentences are grammatical, but some of them are ungrammatical. So the participants have to pay attention and press that.
Okay.
We also have a condition where it's only words, like a word salad, and that gives the classic just word frequency.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Okay, Nancy Coppell is next. Could you pass the microphone, please? Oh.
I was interested in a similar point that was just made before about the ambiguity between harmonics and phrasal structure.
Yeah.
And I agree that it's really important to try to separate that out. I would have guessed that the phrasal structure would be more determinative of what you found than harmonics, because harmonics in size tend to go down, and you weren't seeing things like that.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the harmonics because they can actually be a feature and not a bug. So I'm interested in understanding what they mean. And
but as soon as you start having sentences of more variable length, that goes away.
Yeah, I would agree totally. What is interesting for me is usually that the first harmonic is pretty large, and the second harmonic is small, and this is common finding. For example, even when analyzing brainstem data, for example, the first harmonic of the line noise is very strong, and the second goes down. So
but that
nice.
Was exactly my point. That if you're really dealing with harmonics, you expect that each harmonic would go down in power.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're dealing with something that has an internal structure, like a phrasal period,
Yeah.
then you would not expect to see that kind of decrease in harmonic power.
So I think another point in favor of the analysis that this is maybe is I wouldn't say an artifact, but what actually the FFT allows us to see is the fact that if we assume that the brain is recognizing the phrases and the nature of the phrases, not simply okay, it's a phrase, but saying okay, it's a noun phrase, okay, it's a verb phrase, then the noun phrase repeats at the same frequency as the sentence, right? And the verb phrase repeats at the same frequency as the sentence.
Right, and
So
therefore the time between the beginning and end of the noun phrase is always going to stay there, and that's what the FFT is picking up.
Exactly. So it can show us what it can. It's like walking down a corridor, and what you can see is the line of doors. If you want to see more, you have to enter a door or cross a wall if you can, and then you can see what's in the room, but then you don't see anymore what's outside.
More questions?
Thanks very much. Very great to have you both. Thanks. I just wonder whether we can it's on now. I wonder whether we can speculate. It seems like a friendly meeting. So, in very simple kind of cartoon terms, what it would mean, or like how would a mechanism, an oscillation-based mechanism of hierarchical structure, how could it look like? So I'm sitting there, the way I tend to think is like in a cartoon way. So I'm the brain, and then I have all those oscillations available, and then I'm just going to throw out it was 4 hertz. Okay, so like an oscillation that corresponds to 2-word period, so like 2 hertz oscillation. And at the same time, I'm going to throw out like a 1.33 hertz oscillation to capture a phrase that might come out of 3 words. So basically,
I don't know.
Like
That's my
I think
answer.
it's like I guess in trying to show that, like at least in my mind, there is no plausible way of being prepared for the length of constituent and changing this all the time because you don't know what you're preparing for. So do we really think that it's like hierarchical structure building where those constituent sizes are nowhere predefinable is oscillation based?
It's a big question. I'm not sure if I'm the most qualified person to respond to this, but I will tell you what I think it's in my data. And in my data is simply what Odette says, possibly the fumes of the coding or the transfer of the information at the end that goes on. This is because of the way that we stimulated the brain with constantly repeating structure that is always the same, besides being isochronous. And whether when you talk about shooting some opening a window, we've been talking about this, the fact that you open windows of different temporal windows at the same time. So let's say a delta window, a theta window, and whatever. And I guess one guess could be that if there is an oscillation or a mechanism helping in segmentation and then decoding, is it comes from the interaction between these different levels of temporal analysis. So you can start shooting, and then the delta, and then maybe the theta already ends, and it's helping the delta to keep on shooting, perhaps. But more than that, it's just speculation for me.
Next question.
Okay. Yes. So it's a generalization of what you're saying. I'm thinking about this. Would you agree with the fact that the interesting feature of an oscillator is that you can predict time using the phase? Okay.
Yeah.
So then that means that to use an oscillator, and even more when you speak about entrainment, considering the definition that we had this morning by Joachim, I think it's interesting whenever you're studying a phenomenon that has a temporal periodicity. That's something that is predicted. So what she's arguing is that, in a way, if you have to use an oscillator to predict the beat in music, everyone would agree that that works. Okay, you can do computational modeling, it works. If you're studying syllable levels, then it can sort of work because there is a sort of pseudo-rhythmicity in syllable. But then, in terms of a syntactic structure, one can really wonder, is it really functionally relevant to use, to use an oscillator and to speak about entrainment? For me personally, and I think that's your point you're making, there's no relevance because it's not something that you can have an advantage in predicting in time. On the contrary, I think it's even worse because if you predict in time, now I'm saying structure, subject, verb, noun, and then I change the structure, then you wouldn't be able to follow my toe because you are entrained to the wrong oscillator.
Yeah, I follow what you say, and I agree in general. What I think I would like to say is that anyway, I think this approach is extremely could potentially be very productive in the following way. So if we assume that, and if we follow nice findings, that if you deliver a series of phrases, what you get is actually the entrainment to the phrase. Right, and if you accept some of my conclusions that if you deliver a higher node, then you get that higher node because it's always replicating, then a possibility could be that we can see the highest possible node that the brain is entraining to, or the brain is, if not entraining, the brain is capturing, and the rhythm to that. And this can be used to study in different populations from a developmental perspective or from even a clinical perspective, whether that level of encoding is still preserved, for example. And from this point of view, I think it's an extremely useful tool. And it also gives you a great signal-noise ratio, so I like it.
Just a quick comment on that. So I don't think that the brain will throw out, neural oscillations at all frequencies at the beginning of a phrase. I think it's not really, an oscillation at the beginning. It's more like, after the onset of the structure, the neural response will begin to either maintain a high level of activation or it will drift in one direction. It's more like accumulating information online. It's more like, the decision variable, during a decision-making task. And at the boundary of, the other boundary of the structure, this response will just reset. So it doesn't really need to start to oscillate at a specific frequency. It will just, I think, drift in one direction until the end of the structure. So this way, we don't really need to figure out how long the phrase is at the beginning of it. It's not really offset driven, it's more like, continuous tracking of the structure. Not necessarily oscillation at the beginning.
Yeah, so one thing, and that's the third hypothesis I think that you could make, because you had 1 and 2, and I have 3 actually, and we talked about this briefly over lunch, right? So when I remember like the very first behavioral studies that looked at whether people behaviorally actually chunk words into phrases in line with these trees that you're drawing. Yeah, and that's Miller and Chomsky from the early 60s, I think, and then Lefeld in the 70s. They checked for the subjects whether they really end a chunk at the position that government and binding, for instance, would predict. And that's actually not true for every single individual. Yeah, most of them do this, right? They say, okay, noun, phrase, end, I'm going to chunk this into memory and have some higher level representation, and then I'm going to start the next chunk, right? So could it be that what you see there is actually inter-individual variance in the grammars that people have in their heads?
Right. So it could be, definitely. It could also be that in some very rare cases, participants are trying to extend what is obviously in front of them and will try perhaps to integrate over the 4 words or over the 5 words. In that case, that can create inter-trial variability even, yeah. So what I can say is that the sentence rhythm is there in every participant. The harmonics are not in every participant. So this is an interesting finding, but I don't know whether that's...
Lars, why do you think that a cross-subject variation will be represented in harmonic structure?
Because when I chunk at a different frequency, because I have a different memory span or whatever, or I've acquired a different grammar because my parents spoke differently when I was a baby, right? Then I would show, I don't want to call it entrainment, I would show like projection of structure at a different frequency.
That's okay, but why in harmonic relationship?
Because that's maybe just the size of the, I'm making this up, right? But maybe this is just the size of the chunk that people are using then.
We're going to continue this discussion offline in the coffee break that's coming up. We have one more question.
I was just asking Nai, but it's sort of a global question, whether you would predict the same kind of signature if you have internal vocalization, and whether for building the structure. And the second part actually is whether if you look at the beginning and at the end of a repetition period, you see a decrease or an increase in your power response.
So I'll start with the second one. There is a difference between the onset sentence and the rest of the sentences for each trial. But if I look at each individual sentence, that it's not a difference in where the peak is, but it's just different in energy, normalized maximal power. So it's meaningful because it's the beginning and it starts from silence, so it wakes up the system, and then the rest are almost the same. Like it goes immediately. Like perhaps it's just repetition suppression. It goes too low, but it's interesting. It's a repetition suppression of something that looks like a sentence rhythm. So that's.
I mean, it's just you would expect the opposite. If you have only repetition suppression, or whether you build right away the peak response, right, would actually be more impressive if you had this in this context than the other case where you would have a build-up.
I agree with you. It just goes to a certain level and stays there after the second. And for the first one, I don't remember.
The first one is the internal vocalization. Like, would you predict the same kind of response if participants over the course of the experiment were starting to vocalize the chunking?
Vocalizing internally.
Internal,
okay. I think. I don't know. I guess that if they are vocalizing internally, they have to build up and track. You mean repeating internally what they are hearing, something like that? Yeah. So I think there would be a lag in time, and I guess they would have to do actually. That's pretty interesting. They would have to do a build up, at least from a lexical level. That is because all words are new and all sentences are different. So that may actually. Wake up some more online building mechanism. We could try it. It's a good idea.
Okay, let's thank the speaker and get some coffee.